Hello, and welcome to part 2 of my 4-part series, So You Want to Buy a Mountain Bike. It can be easy to get caught up in marketing speak and flashy new products when you're looking for a mountain bike. But I want to tell you that whenever you're looking for a bike, the first thing you should be looking at is the geometry. The geometry is going to be the most important aspect of how a bike rides. Simply put, geometry is a laundry list of lengths and angles that determine how your bike is going to feel when you're out there on the trail. Today I'm going to be looking at a handful of geometry numbers you should be looking at when purchasing your next bike. I should preface this video by saying that geometry is not going to be the final say in the bike that you purchase, but rather you actually getting out and test riding the bike. Look for local demo days or rentals around your area. And if you do decide to do a demo day or a rental, look up the geometry, go for your test ride, and then come back and process how the geometry of that specific bike affected your ride. The best thing you can do is ride as many bikes as you can before you make your purchase. So let's get into it. Now I'm going to start at the front of the bike, where I feel like the most important thing to look at is the head tube angle. Now, if you saw my previous video, I went over briefly what the head tube angle is, but I'll go over again. It's basically the angle this head tube right here makes in correlation with the ground when it's flat. This angle is going to determine how the bike handles. A steeper angle is going to make the bike more twitchy and will allow you to get over the front when you need to weight the front in tighter situations. Cross-country riders tend to have steeper head tube angles because they need the bike to be more agile. They find themselves in a lot more low-speed situations such as climbing or navigating tight technical switchbacks. Having a steeper head tube angle means that they can maneuver the bike a lot more easily in slower speed situations. You can think of it this way. The slacker the head tube, the more stable the bike will be when going downhill. So that's why you see a lot of enduro and downhill bikes that have very slack head tubes, because they find themselves going downhill at much higher speeds. And they're going downhill much more of the time than a cross-country rider. Is one better or worse? Not really. You have to determine what your trails are like in your area. Are you going to find yourself at the park mostly, where you get lift service? Then you may want a more slack head tube angle. Or if you find yourself on trails that have just as much climbing as descending, you might want something a little more steep so that you can navigate those tight, twisty trails. I'd also like to note that sometimes bike manufacturers allow the bike to be run with different fork lengths. If you run a longer fork, so if you run a fork with more travel, it's going to actually slacken up your head tube angle, make it a little less steep. I can run this bike with a 130 millimeter fork, even though it came with a 120 millimeter fork. That's actually going to affect the geometry everywhere on the bike. It's going to bring up the front a little bit and change some of the angles. So it's important to really do your research and figure out if your bike can be run in different geometries. Sometimes they come with things called flip chips that actually allow you to change up the whole geometry of the bike depending on the situation you're riding in. Now moving on to the middle of the bike, I'm going to explain the seat tube angle, the reach, as well as the wheelbase and how your wheel diameter can also affect how the bike rides. Lately, seat tubes have been getting steeper and steeper, and the reason is that we have dropper posts now. Dropper posts allow us to get the saddle out of the way whenever we're going downhill, but then bring it back to the normal position when we want to climb. The more you can get over the bottom bracket, the more efficient your pedal stroke is going to be. This allows you to get the most out of every pedal turn. So I would encourage you to look for a steeper seat tube angle. It's important to note that when talking about the seat tube angle, there's two different ways it can be calculated. First is the actual seat tube angle, so how the angle of the seat is in comparison to the floor. But that's not going to be true to how it actually feels, mostly because our contact point with the bottom bracket is going to be offset sometimes from where our contact point with the saddle is. This is called the effective seat tube angle. So you might look online and you might see that some bikes have a seat tube angle of, I don't know, 68 degrees or something. But then below it says the effective seat tube angle is something like 74. The reason for this is because not all bikes have a bottom bracket that's directly in line with their seat tube angle. Sometimes they're offset. So that's important to make that note. Then I'll talk about reach. Reach is basically, as it says, how much you're going to be reaching on the bike, and it's measured from your saddle to the center of the stem. Now you can adjust your reach a little bit by either moving your saddle in or out or getting longer or shorter stems. For the longest time, we determined how a bike should fit based on the standover height. Basically, when you stood over the top tube, how much height you had from the ground. The reason we don't do that anymore is that we have sloping top tubes. So the important number to look for when it comes to sizing is your reach. Reach can also determine how nimble a bike feels. A smaller reach might make a bike feel a little bit more twitchy, which might be advantageous for cross-country riding or areas where you have tight switchbacks that you have to navigate at slower speeds. A longer reach bike is going to feel a little more stable when you're going downhill at speed. So while I'm here, I'm also going to explain wheelbase. Like reach, wheelbase is going to determine how a bike feels, how stable it feels. The measurement for wheelbase is pretty simple, the distance between where the front and the rear tire touch the ground. A long wheelbase is going to feel more stable, and a short wheelbase is going to feel more twitchy. Typically, you'll see on cross-country bikes a shorter wheelbase. This allows the cross-country riders to be a little bit more precise whenever they're navigating tight trails or going uphill. Whereas downhill riders or enduro riders sometimes like to have a little bit longer wheelbase because it means they'll have more stability when they're going at high speeds in technical downhill terrain. When it comes to wheel diameter, there's really only two options, 27.5 inch and 29 inch. There's long been debate on which one is better, but for the most part we all agree that 29 inch wheels are going to roll a little bit better over chunky terrain, whereas 27.5 inch wheels are going to be a little bit more nimble. Also too, you should know, some shorter riders tend to prefer 27.5 inch wheels because they're much more maneuverable than 29 inch. The final two aspects of geometry I'm going to talk about are the chainstay length and the bottom bracket height. The bottom bracket height, simply put, is the height of the bottom bracket to the ground, whereas the chainstay length is the distance from your bottom bracket to your rear hub. A longer chainstay length is going to be a more stable bike, but it doesn't mean longer is always better. In fact, a lot of people like a shorter chainstay because it's easier to jump and it's easier to manual, and it makes the bike feel a little bit more agile in the back. If you combine a short chainstay with a relatively slack head tube angle, it still gives you the stability of a long wheelbase bike, but then you have a nice nimble back end that makes it easier to get the bike off the ground and do manuals. A shorter bottom bracket height will make it feel like you're sitting in the bike rather than on the bike, which basically means it'll feel more stable and a little bit more telepathic when you're riding. But that doesn't always mean it's the best option. The reason being is because a short bottom bracket height can actually cause more pedal strike and bottom out over technical terrain. So determine what you might need based on your terrain. For instance, here in Central Texas, I actually prefer to have a little bit higher bottom bracket, mostly because we have a lot of big rocks and technical squared off drops that make it easier for me to bottom out or strike my pedals on a rock. So to avoid that, whenever I'm looking for a bike, I like to have a little bit higher bottom bracket. If I was in a place that had more flow trails or more downhill, I might look for a little bit lower bottom bracket because it'll give me more stability whenever I'm at high speeds or going downhill. I hope this video was helpful and gave you a little more insight in how geometry affects how our bikes ride. But it's important not to focus on just one aspect of the geometry, but rather how the whole geometry of the bike affects the ride, which is why I want to reiterate how important it is that you try and ride as many bikes as you can. Go to demo days, rent bikes, ask a friend if you can ride theirs, and then get a better picture of how the geometry of each of those bikes is affecting the ride. If you like this video, please consider subscribing to my channel and hitting the like button below.